Is it worth it to trade up in the NFL draft to get that franchise quarterback? That's the question we're going to talk to our good friend Josh Edwards from CBSSports.com. He writes about the NFL and other things there. Is it worth it? That's the big $1 million question. And Josh, I was fascinated by your piece, and I want you to talk about it a little bit. But just off the top, I think that the NFL and quarterbacks, right? It's a quarterback league. Everyone talks about the fact that you can't win unless you have a quarterback. Have you found and we'll get into the details in a second, but have you found, working on the story too, that has it changed much? Has it always been trade up for the quarterback has been sort of a thing and a priority in the NFL?
I think it's still very much a priority in the NFL. Patrick Mahomes, of course, is somebody that Kansas City had to trade up for. Deshaun Watson at the time was somebody that Houston had to trade up for. I mean, Caleb Williams was not acquired by conventional means. Bryce Young, of course, was not acquired by conventional means. So, I still think teams believe in trading up to get that player because at the end of the day, the odds are in your favor if you do have a first-round pick. Now, that's not to say that if you use a first-round pick on a quarterback, that player is going to work out, which was kind of one of the findings of this piece, because there's so many other contributory factors. It's all about what kind of a situation that player is in, what kind of coaching, the scheme, various different details can go into whether or not a quarterback is going to be successful. Now, the other way of looking at it is the Philadelphia Eagles just won with Jalen Hurts. They drafted Jalen Hurts when they had Carson Wentz, a first-round pick that the Eagles had traded up for. They brought Hurts in on a rookie contract. He was able to develop and learn at his own pace, and it just so happened that he worked out to be the quarterback of the future for the Eagles. And ultimately they moved on from Carson Wentz. So that was kind of an unorthodox situation. We've seen how they've been able to build their roster because of Jalen Hurts. They've been able to go out and they've gotten, AJ Brown. They've gotten all these guys that they've traded for. They built through the trenches. Like, they have a philosophy that you stick to, which I think is incredibly important in all this as well. So trading up for a quarterback isn't necessarily going to translate to Super Bowl success. But I think if you have a philosophy that you stick to, if you have an understanding of how you want to build your roster, you execute well, trading up for a quarterback is still a very viable way to fill the position in today's NFL.
Right. And I love how you did this. And I want you to explain it to people a little bit, because I find in discussions around this, I'll talk about a quarterback. Well, look at this team. They drafted this quarterback there. And what did he do? He never won a Super Bowl. Well, is Super Bowl the only judge? Is Super Bowl the only measure? And you called this what you dubbed kind of revisionist view, and how you elaborate and talk about and analyze whether or not this has worked out for teams. Is it worth the bet, so to speak? Talk a little bit about how you put that system together and what exactly it is. So when we talk about the details here, people have an understanding for how you're evaluating this.
Yeah, so first and foremost, we use RGIII's trade value chart. He works with us at sportsline.com, does a great job. So that kind of gives me some insight into the value of each pick. Now, when you're talking about trades of consequence, moving up the board into the top 5 of a draft, often that involves future compensation. You're giving up a future first-round pick in most cases. So how do you quantify that? When you're looking in the future, I think a lot of teams will probably say, they'll look at how they project that team for the future, because you don't want to trade. You don't want to acquire a future first-round pick and that end up being the number 32 overall pick, because you're just not getting value in return. So I think most teams probably sit at like 16 to 18 in terms of how they view that future first round pick. One thing to consider is when you're making a trade up the board to get this quarterback, you're trading away assets. You're trading away valuable draft picks that could be used to supplement your roster and support the quarterback that you're trading up for. So it is a little bit of a compromise. I think you have to have a good situation, again, a complete roster to where you can kind of drop that quarterback in, because with the exception of Jaden Daniels and a few other quarterbacks that we've seen, it's incredibly difficult to rise above your circumstances. And what I found looking back in the past, we've seen teams trade up for Carson Wentz. Carson Wentz was good for a short period of time for Philadelphia, but that did not work out for them long term. Robert Griffin III, he of course had injuries, but Washington paid a ton to move up for him. So I wanted to go back and look at what teams actually gave up. Once the trade had kind of settled, what teams were giving up. And what I found is you do have to overpay if you're trading up for a quarterback. And the equivalency of that is usually the number 22 overall pick. So it's equal value plus the number 22 overall pick is kind of what I found is the going rate for trading up for a quarterback. Last year is kind of skewing it a little bit because Minnesota traded up one pick and they didn't give up future compensation. So it was almost like a 1-for-1 trade. So that kind of skewed it a little bit, but not when you're looking at a course of a decade, it hasn't skewed it so much that I don't think that it applies anymore.
Well, and it's fascinating with this too. And you talked about basically equal value plus the 22 overall pick, and this pick equivalency that you have here after analyzing these trades. The end result is that trading away that quarterback pick, the team getting the compensation wins out, right? They get greater compensation, if you will. Now, what's the primary factors for that overpayment? Is it just the importance of the position and the perceived kind of run on those quarterbacks? Because we're talking about NFL general managers here and teams and coaches. These are experienced people, but you sometimes see a feeding frenzy here, and then people do overpay.
Yeah, it's largely due to the position. Of course, the quarterback is the most important position in the game of football. One of the sacrifices that teams make when they trade out of the top 5, top 3 overall is that you're also getting rid of the opportunity to take a blue chip player to a different position. Maybe you have a needed edge rusher. Maybe you're looking for one of those game-changing pass rushers that's not going to be available at the position that you would theoretically trade back to. So it is a little bit of a sacrifice to make that decision. But I think why the reason for the overpay is simply because of the future value, because it's difficult to quantify. Teams want to know that they're going to get the better end of the deal. So the other team has to overpay because a team could say, hey, I don't know if you're going to pick number 20 overall next year. I don't know if you're going to be the number 1 overall pick. Like in the case of Carolina moving up to number 1 with, Chicago, and the Chicago getting the number 1 overall pick in return the following year, that's a home run for Chicago because it allowed them to get their quarterback of the future. But the difference in value between that number 1 overall pick and the number 16 or 20 or wherever it falls is, almost 500 points in our scale, which is just multiple first round picks. So, when you're trading that future compensation, teams don't want to be on the losing end of getting something in return for that premium draft position that would be used on a quarterback. So that's why teams coming up the board ultimately have to overpay.
And then let me ask you this, because obviously the quarterback position, like you said, most important position. When you have a year like last year where you clearly had 3 quarterbacks or 2 quarterbacks, definitely in the top 2 picks. And then this year, again, you talked about it in your piece too. Cam Ward is there. He's perceived as the number 1 overall pick. How much does that then drive up the compensation required to move up in the first round?
Well, there's 2 ways of looking at it. It's a matter of supply and demand, which is, just a basic economic philosophy. There may only be 1 quarterback that teams are comfortable trading up for in this draft class, and that would be Cam Ward. I don't know that teams view Shedeur Sanders in a similar light. There may be some teams. I think the way that I've explained it to this point is similar to Will Levis. I think there are teams that value him highly. But if those teams go in a different direction, then you could see a little bit of a slide the way that we saw with Levis. I don't think that he's going to be everybody's cup of tea. So if Ward is truly the quarterback 1 in this class and teams do not see it being that close of a competition, there's going to be more urgency to move up the board. Now, how does Cam Ward stack up with previous draft classes? Last year was incredibly deep. We had Drake May, we had Caleb Williams, we had Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix, Michael Penix. I mean, someone like Bo Nix, with what we had seen last year, would rank very, very highly in this draft class. Cam Ward, for me, would probably be, I think, the fifth quarterback in last year's draft class.
Yeah.
So it's a totally different conversation. But if you need to fill the quarterback position, teams are going to feel the need to make an aggressive move. And as I've detailed in the article, it requires an overpay. I don't think it's going to be as steep as we've seen in years past. Maybe it's like 10% inflation as opposed to 20% or whatever that number ends up being. But teams are still going to have to overpay to move up if they want to entice Tennessee to move out of that number one overall pick.
And the main reason for that 10%, I know you mentioned that in the piece too, that inflation, is that based on the talent pool? Is that based on the increase in cap money and what teams are able to spend, even though I know the rookie bonuses don't count towards that? But what drives that inflation overall?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the premium position of the quarterback. Year over year, it has been about 20% for a team to move up the board. But I think this year, just because Cam Ward is not perceived in a similar light to what we saw last draft class, it wouldn't require as much unless you see like the Browns and the Giants get in a bidding war. But, then it becomes irrelevant if Tennessee just decides, hey, we're going to take Cam Ward ourselves, which I think is a very, not even very realistic, but very probable outcome just based on the moves that we've seen them make this offseason. I think it's likely Tennessee's just going to stick and pick Ward at number one overall, which kind of makes this whole conversation almost pointless. But if that pick is up for sale, I think in a normal year with a solidified number one overall quality quarterback, you would expect to get that 20% type of inflation on the pick value, which is about 900. It varies depending on the player available, but about 900 points in our scale, which the second pick is like 778 points. It's almost a 218, 212, whatever it ends up being, point deficit. And that's the equivalent of a first round pick. So it's very impactful in terms of having one of those top 5 overall picks.
Well, let me ask you this. You're sitting there as a GM of an NFL team, one of the 4, I mean, you could go out to maybe 6 teams that actually could use a young quarterback, even though some of them signed some veterans. What would you do? I mean, is Cam Ward, if you got to move from 5 or 6 or whatever the number is in the first round, you want to move up to number 1 to make sure you get Cam Ward. If you're that GM, Josh, do you pay the premium price to do it?
I would pay within reason. It wouldn't be like previous years where I would trade multiple first round picks. I'm just not to that point with Cam Ward. I think he's a good talent. I think he's a playmaker. I think he's got that improv capability that you look for from the position, where at any moment he could make a play that changes the game. But we also haven't seen the same level of consistency from him as we have seen from other quarterbacks. So, yeah, if I had a need at the quarterback position, I would pay to move up the board. There is a point where I would just say, this is not worth it for us. Maybe we'll take one of those quarterbacks in tier 2. Maybe we'll wait until next year to address the position. And that's the other part of the conversation, because teams are looking forward to future quarterback classes. And to this point, there's a lot of intriguing names in the 2026 NFL draft class. There's not any that I would say, okay, this is a bona fide number 1 overall player right now. This is going to be Caleb Williams in a year. This is going to be Andrew Luck in a year. I don't see that at this point. So that makes it a little bit more difficult to project moving forward as well. And maybe that is what pushes a team to be a little bit more aggressive this year, because you don't know what the future holds. And, the other part of this conversation is all of these teams are on different timelines. Like if you look at the Giants, it's kind of known that this is a make or break year for Brian Daboll and Joe Schoen. Like they've got to go win. So why would you, as somebody that is not guaranteed the future, be concerned about future draft picks? All they know is that they need a quarterback. They need a reason for hope. They need something to keep them in their job for at least one more year. And trading up the board, future assets be darned, is potentially the way to do that.
Yeah, it's a great point because I was about to bring it up because that's the thing is you depending where you're at. Okay, you're Pete Carroll and John Spytek in Vegas. You just got there. You probably got a couple years,
Right.
but other people are under the gun. But even in that situation where you're new to a team, the NFL, you got to win now, and so you can't hope and pray that a year from now or 2 years from now that there'll be the player there, right? The quarterback, like you said, next year, there's nothing special that's making you scream, hey, wow, this is a great quarterback class. And number two is that you don't know what your record's going to be. These teams, they might have won 3 or 4 games this year and they could sneak out 7, 8 next year. And they're back in the middle of the first round and looking to have to trade up to get a quarterback. So it's kind of a perpetual thing. I think that sometimes happens. And so that balance is tough, isn't it? Between going now for needs that you have and maybe perhaps being patient and looking down the road.
Yeah, 100%. That factors into the conversation with Tennessee and Las Vegas and all these teams that we've been discussing. Tennessee, Brian Callahan has been there for a year. I would not think that they'll move on from him after a year or two, but it may be a situation where he says, all right, let's go ahead and get our quarterback of the future. Let's try to build around him, maybe get some stability in this building. Coming into the offseason, I think he really wanted a veteran quarterback. I think he was frustrated by the lack of consistency that he saw from the position a year ago, and was ultimately hopeful that someone like Sam Darnold or, maybe they still go out and they go get Kirk Cousins. I mean, I don't know what the future holds for them, but I think he wants more stability from that position. And I don't think Levis is a part of the conversation just based on the interactions that I saw between player and coach last year. With Pete Carroll's age, I do think there's maybe a little bit of urgency to win now. And I think that's why they went out and they got Geno Smith. And at the same time, I also wonder if they're trying to win now, are they going to surrender future draft capital to move up the board rather than surrounding Geno with the talent that's going to allow him to be successful in a year or two? Because you went out and you got a quarterback that's ready to succeed now. If you trade away that future capital and you're not able to build around that player within the next 2 years, then you're essentially wasting the next 2 or 3 years of not only Geno Smith's future, but your organization as well. It's kind of like, what was the point of doing this if you were just kind of rebuilding anyway? So that's kind of why I think Las Vegas is going to be inclined to stay where they are. And if maybe Shedeur Sanders is there, that would probably be a situation that they would consider. But I have a hard time believing that they're going to surrender a lot to invest in the future when it's very clear that they're kind of sending a message to win right now.
Yeah, especially with some of the other offensive players that are on the board there, Genty and others that could be available to them at 6. So it'll be fascinating. And Josh, we will continue to follow everything you do. Make sure you follow Josh on X at Edwards CBS, and he'll be rooting for his Musketeers as they move forward in the NCAA tournament.
True.
Josh, as always, man, a pleasure. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, of course, anytime.